Hello, it's me again, Pastor Daniel. I would like to give you quite a very good insight about something that I think is going to help you to be able to understand the Bible. Now, when I understood this, I was able to easily navigate through the Bible and I was able to understand different aspects in the Bible. And this, I think, is going to be able to help you to understand the Bible. If you're reading the Bible and sometimes you're wondering, is this related to the New Testament or the Old Testament, then this is going to be able to help you. Sometimes the Bible has been interpreted out of context, and as a result, people are applying things which are not necessarily supposed to be applied in that particular context. It is important for you to understand the bigger and broader context in which the Bible is written, but then also to understand how what applies in the different aspects within the Bible. And understanding this is going to be able to help you to understand what, where, what, and when of the different aspects of the Bible. So let's go. The Bible is in different covenants. These different covenants reflect the different relationships that God had with eminent people in the Bible, and these relationships were able to frame how things were taking place in the Bible. We know that in the beginning, God created Adam, and Adam had his wife and then children. But we know along the way in Genesis, many people started doing many bad things at that particular time in the world. Genesis chapter 6 clearly tells us that God was actually fed up of what the people were doing at that particular time. And then what we see later on is that the flood comes in and many people die. And as a result, God raises a man that we know in the Bible called Noah, that this man has a covenant made between him and God. This covenant is what we know as the Noahic covenant. It is the first covenant the Bible talks about that God made with the human race through one man called Noah. Now, I want you to know that God has always desired to have a relationship with the human race, which he actually created. He's the creator of you and I, and therefore he always and still always does have a desire to have a relationship with the human race. Definitely the human race needs him more than he does need it, but God in his mercy and his grace, he continues to want to have a relationship with us. And therefore these covenants are very important, are a demonstration of God's intention to continue having a relationship with the human race. So God made a covenant with Noah, and this covenant is the first covenant that we see in the Bible that he made with Noah. And you find it in Genesis chapter 9, verse 12 to 13. And this covenant was a reflection of something that God had made himself say that he will not do again, and that is the flood, where he had destroyed the entire human race. God promised that he would never again send a worldwide flood to destroy all life on earth. And this covenant was an unconditional promise, an unconditional covenant, where Noah did not necessarily have to do anything, did not pray for it. God just decided to make this covenant with him. And it relies on God's entire faithfulness, regardless of what is taking place in the human race, or regardless of what was taking place at that time. God made that covenant with Noah that he would not destroy the earth with waters again. There was a symbol that was given for this covenant. Every covenant normally has a symbol. It has people that are involved in that covenant, and then it has a symbol. Maybe if I can back up a bit and speak about briefly what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement that can be between two people or between two entities, and this covenant normally has terms and conditions. These terms and conditions are to be fulfilled with either party. So it depends on what kind of agreement it is. For those who work, sometimes you may get a contract, and that contract is some kind of covenant that you have with the company, with the entity which you are working with. And normally there are terms and conditions that you will have for this contract. And so a covenant is the same. There are normally terms and conditions, an agreement between two people or between two entities. And these contract. So this agreement has terms and conditions for each party to actually fulfill. So one party does this, then the other party does the other person. When one party does not do something, then the other party, there are consequences whenever the either party does not honor their terms or the agreement. And so in brief, that is what a covenant is like. And those days, many hundreds of years, they would do covenants. Even the human beings at the time, they would do covenants. There would be covenants made in blood, there would be covenants made in word, and some of them would be written. Even kings would make covenants with other kings, and then each king was required to actually fulfill the terms of the covenant. If they did not fulfill, there are consequences that would be actually stated in that covenant, on that agreement, which would take force or effect when one of them does not actually fulfill the terms of that covenant or that agreement. So it is similar even with the covenant that God made with Noah, only that the covenant, the type of covenant that God made with Noah was an unconditional one. An unconditional covenant is where somebody just says, I have decided to be good to you. I have decided to give this to you. You just don't need to do anything. I'll give it to you anyway. I'll do it for you anyway. You are not required to do any specific thing. This kind of covenant that Noah had with God was that kind of covenant which was unconditional. Noah just didn't ask for it. He just needed to accept the terms and just had to accept the covenant because it was good anyway. And so he had to accept it. So each covenant normally has terms and conditions, but then also has a symbol or has something that is used to indicate that you have stuck to the covenant and you'd like to continue fulfilling the covenant and you stand by the covenant that you made. So in this particular case, God put there a symbol of the rainbow. The symbol of the rainbow was something that would remind Noah and God that this was a covenant that he would not destroy the earth again. And then when you look through the Bible, you find that this covenant between Noah and God, all the events that took place around or after that covenant will take place between Genesis chapter 1 broadly up to Genesis chapter 11. He promised not to destroy the earth. If you remember in Genesis chapter 9, God actually asked Noah to go ahead and multiply as the same instruction that he had given Adam and Eve. So that's the first covenant that we see in the Bible. So you're able to contextualize all the scriptures around after Noah because it's a covenant that was made broadly about not destroying the earth. And we saw, of course, people continued to live. And we also saw that eventually there was a Tower of Babel and several other things that take place thereafter, just before Abraham comes into the picture. So speaking of Abraham, would like to go to the next covenant, which is the covenant that God made with Abraham, which starts from Genesis chapter 12. He speaks about the covenant that God made with Abraham. Abraham was asked by God to get out of his home village, to get out of where he was born, his parents, and then come and go to a particular place that God was going to tell him. He actually didn't know where he was going, but he obeyed God and actually followed all the way. So God made a covenant with Abraham. And that covenant with Abraham, you go back and read it in Genesis chapter 15 through 17. You will be able to delve deep into the covenant that God made with Abraham. So Abraham starts all the way from Genesis chapter 12 and continues all the way Genesis chapter 12 and continues all the way to Genesis chapter 50. So sort of the bigger part of Genesis speaks about all what takes place in that period is broadly under the covenant that God had made with Abraham. So I just want to mention briefly what the covenant was about. It was about the land that God had promised Abraham and his descendants, that they would have a place where his generations after would live. The second is that they would be blessed. You remember the scripture in Genesis chapter 15 that his generations after him would be blessed and will be as the sand and the stars in the sky. God promised to bless him and the generation after him. And also this covenant was unconditional. It was unconditional because he believed in God and God made a covenant with him. So the supply was more on God's side. So God was supplying and he was on the receiving end. So in a kind of covenant where it is unconditional, you find that one side is on the supply side and the other one is on the receiving end. So For Abraham, he was mostly on the receiving side of things for this particular covenant, just like Noah was on the receiving side of things. So God promised him land. God promised that his seed would multiply and be many, and God promised a blessing upon his generations and generations after him. And then this covenant was unconditional. It kind of gives us a picture of what the broader part of Genesis was about, or the context in which they were operating in at the time. They were operating under these covenants in Genesis, broadly Genesis chapter 1 up to chapter 50, because in there we have Noah, and then we later on have the covenant that God made with Abraham, which takes us all the way to Genesis chapter 50. But one other thing about this covenant is that it was an everlasting covenant. It would remain for generation to generations, and it would not stop. Of course, we eventually see that is the covenant under which that also Jesus Christ, eventually when he comes on earth, he comes through that covenant. And I'll speak about that when it comes to that covenant. So what is the symbol? What is the symbol for this covenant? It was circumcision. It was circumcision. So children would be circumcised, boys would be circumcised at an early age of their lives, around 8 years, they would be circumcised, and it was a symbol to symbolize that we are stuck to this covenant that God made with Abraham. And we see that happening all the way in the bigger part of Genesis, all the way to Genesis chapter 50. So we've seen that the covenant is unconditional. Covenant between God and Abraham is unconditional. It is for the seed of Abraham that it would multiply and be many, but you also see that there will be a blessed generation after him. And then we also see that it's an everlasting covenant that God made between Abraham and God, and then for the generations that would come after him. It is important to remember that there are other covenants that were made between God and man at a particular time, and I'll be talking more about those other covenants. So we've talked about 2 covenants. That's the covenant between God and Noah. We've talked about the covenant between Abraham and God, and there are 3 other covenants. There are 3 other covenants that I have not talked about, that I'll be talking about in the next video about the other covenants, because broadly in the Bible we have 5 covenants, and these 5 covenants sort of contextualize the chapters and the books in the Bible, so that we can be able to apply them properly and be able to understand the context in which something was taking place. Once you understand that, then you're able to understand the Bible and know which verse applies where and when it should actually be applied. Though broadly the Bible is all in sync, you just need to know when to apply what, and what means and ways were being used at particular times when the different covenants were in force. God bless you. Like and share and subscribe to our channel. God bless you, and look forward to meeting you in the next video. God bless you.